what Mary and I are doing in these presentations, exploring assessment, is moving backwards and forwards between the history and development of assessment and introducing some of the key concept of assessment. Now, one of the key distinctions around kinds of assessment is between select response assessments, so for example, A, B, C, D answers, and supply response assessments, which might be a one-sentence answer, it might be a word filled in a gap, or it may be an essay. It may be something that's longer, or it may, in the modern world, be an artefact. It may be a digital portfolio. It may be a video. I mean, goodness knows what it might be. In other words, what you've done is you've supplied a piece of content. So they're the two canonical forms of assessment. But in both cases, what these are originally is separate artefacts, and kind of strange artefacts in a way. So the select response assessment is a strange artefact designed for the purposes of seeing what you know, A, B, C, D answers. It's a genre, and it's not what you do in learning, it's what you do in this strange separate space called assessment at the end of the week or the end of the semester. Likewise, the supply response assessment, you go into an exam room and you get given a question and you write the answer out. And again, it's a kind of a strange event because nowhere else in the rest of life are you ever going to be stuck in a room for 2 hours with no books, having to write something for the purposes of your measurement, right? So, it's a peculiar kind of form of meaning, a form of textuality, and so these are the two peculiar kinds of things we do in education when we do this distinct thing that we call assessment.
What both these forms of assessments do is they require a type of person. So although we think we're discovering what somebody has learned, cognition, their IQ, knowledge, in fact, we are preparing learners to be orderly, to be lockstep, to regurgitate, to remember, to retain and remember for the purposes of the test. And this creates often for many students, both these types of tests, a kind of test anxiety. It ends up labeling them in some way that creates a sense of, I do well, somebody else doesn't do so well. So it affects their own sense of motivation. There's nothing terribly motivating at the end to be told that you got an A or a B or a C. It doesn't tell you very much, and it doesn't motivate you necessarily to modify and learn again what you need to learn. Even though you might want to improve your score, it's demotivating if you end up at the bottom rather than at the top. So it is important as we think about these things, they're not just models, they actually have a human effect. They have an effect on the individual, on the learner. They even have an effect on the teacher, because the teacher is, in some cases, there's arguments about the teacher being assessed by the degree to which their learners perform in assessments. So there's a lot of stress on the teacher as well to be able to increase the scores or to generate that curve that we shared with you earlier.
So I'm going to begin now sort of analysing in a technical sense these two forms of assessment. So select response assessments involve item creation. So the way item creation works is a question with, say, 4 answers, A, B, C, D. And one of those answers must be right, but there must be an answer which seems right. So these things are revealingly called distractor items. So in other words, it's not just a matter of designing the right item, it's a matter of designing deceptively nearly correct distractor items. Now, in a way, that means that the business of item design becomes a game, and we learn in schools to play the game, which is, how are they tricking me? Firstly, we'll eliminate the one that's obviously wrong, and then we'll try and work out why this other one is a trick. So there's a kind of, in a way, doing well in item-based assessment is learning the nuances of that game, right? And one of the problematic things is you may give the right answer, but not understand the reasoning. And the reasoning you have for choosing the distractor item may well be the correct reasoning. So what I'm really saying is that there's a kind of a strange logic to these kinds of assessments, being good at them as part of the game of being good at school. Learning to play the game is learning to do these assessments well. It's not just about what you know. Now, what underlies then the most sophisticated version of select response assessments is a theory called item response theory. So what item response theory does is that it builds a test with a whole lot of questions which are graded by difficulty, which means that if I'm not very good at a particular subject, I'm going to be able to answer some questions, and then when I reach a certain threshold, I can maybe answer them, but at another threshold, I'm not going to be able to answer them. They're hard. So there's a mixture of different levels of difficulty in the test. And the test then should cover the range of the learners, but also then what we can do is we can do statistical analyses which evaluate the difficulty of the item in use, and then measure that item difficulty against the population of learners who are distributed, inevitably must be in this theory, again, across something like a bell curve. For the theory to work, you want some easy questions for the people down that end of the bell curve, and you want some hard questions for the people up the other end of the bell curve in order to really distinguish what the threshold of their knowledge is. Now, most recently, the most sophisticated forms of item response theory are in computer adaptive testing, where what we've done is we've mechanized that process. So what we do is we build a bank of hundreds of items, and in fact, it doesn't take many items to work out where the items are at the appropriate difficulty. So if you get an item wrong, the next one's easier. You get it wrong again, the next one's easier. You start getting it right, the next one's a bit more difficult. So by grading them across this grade of difficulty, we can actually do tests which are much quicker, because we can get to the level of ability or capacity or knowledge that you have quite quickly. But also what we can do is we can avoid cheating, because nobody does the same test. The test gets recalibrated on the fly, depending on the score that you're developing over time. So that's a little kind of a technical description of how these things work. Strange artifacts, of course. And what's interesting is that with the latest and most sophisticated computer adaptive testing, we still work with the underlying epistemological assumptions and the underlying mechanics that have been in item response theory for a very long time. Now, the other concept I wanted to mention in relation to select response assessments is this notion of standardized testing. So standardizing means, to be fair, to measure everybody, we're going to give them all the same test, right? Now, this cartoon here is it's become a meme. You see it around all the time now, but it's quite a lovely lovely reflection on the fact, well, why do we all have to be the same? One of the arguments about intelligence, for example, the Howard Gardner idea of multiple intelligence, is that we can be intelligent in different kinds of ways, but also what this cartoon highlights is, we may be good at some things, not others, and it depends on my relationship to the task, what I'm good at and what I'm not just my native capacity compared to the next person. So, but anyhow, what we do is, the whole idea of standardized testing is we are fair by giving people the same test, and it's a genuine measure of each student against each other, and it's a fair measure as we put them across the curve of inequality, because we're measuring them by the same thing. Well, in life, why do you want to measure things by the same thing when they're different? But we do. That's what we do in education. So again, what I'm trying to do here is try to unpack some of the underlying logic of this assessment form.